Auspicious greeting. Welcome back to the core teaching class. Last class, we talked about karma and how it fit into our life. And obviously, we want to act skillfully so that we can end our sufferings. And just like the Buddha had mentioned, all of his teachings is about sufferings and the ending of sufferings. And one of the concepts that he used to define sufferings is the five clinging skandhas, or you might heard of the term five skandhas, or you might heard of the English translation version, which is the five aggregate. So skandhas is basically a Sanskrit word that means a heap and accumulations, or a pile, a bundle, or a mass. But normally in English, we translate it as aggregate. And this is why we also call the five skandhas as the five aggregate. And when in one of the sutras, the Buddha told us that the five skandhas are a burden for us. And this is what he said. The Blessed One said, and which is the burden? The five clinging aggregate, it should be said. Which five? The form clinging aggregate, the feeling clinging aggregate, the perception clinging aggregate, the fabrication clinging aggregate, the consciousness clinging aggregate. This, monk, is called the burden. And which is the carrier of the burden? The person. It should be said, this venerable one with such a name, such a clan name, this is called the carrier of the burden. Well, basically, the Buddha told us that, of course, the burden are the five clinging aggregate, which we'll talk more in a bit. And we, every one of us, are the carrier of this burden. And in other words, we all carry this burden. And then the Buddha continued to tell us why we take up this burden. And he said, and which is the taking up of the burden? The craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, for example, craving for sensualities, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. This is called the taking up of the burden. So we take up this burden because of our craving. And what kind of craving? It's craving for sensualities, craving for becoming, meaning like craving for existence and assuming a powerful and famous identities, or craving for not experiencing unpleasant things in the current and future lives, such as unpleasant people or unpleasant situations. It is all due to these craving that we take up the burden. This is why craving is the cause of sufferings. So if we remember back to the class that we talk about the Four Noble Truths, the cause of sufferings is our craving. Not only do we take up these burden, and we start to assume these five aggregate as a self, and of course we cling to them very dearly. This is what the Buddha said. An uninstructed runs of a mule person, meaning someone who did not learn the Dharma, who is ignorant of the Dharma, who has no regard for the Noble One, is not well versed or disciplined in their Dharma, who has no regard for people of integrity, is not well versed or disciplined in their Dharma, assume form to be the self, or the self as possessing form, or form as an in the self, or the self as in form. He assumed feelings to be the self, he assumed perceptions to be the self, he assumed fabrication to be the self, and he assumed consciousness to be the self, or the self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in the self, or the self as in consciousness. He get attached to form, cling to form, and determine it to be myself. He get attached to feelings, he get attached to perception, he get attached to fabrication, he get attached to consciousness, cling to consciousness and determine it to be myself. These five clinging aggregate attach to, cling to, will lead to long-term loss and sufferings. So someone who hasn't learned about the truth would assume form, feeling, perception, volition, consciousness as a self. And we become attached to these five aggregate and cling to them. This, of course, ultimately will lead to our long-term loss and sufferings. This is why sometimes when someone asks a Buddhist how we answer questions like, who am I, or what is this person, they would answer, the Buddha told us that each sentient beings can be understood in terms of a combination of phenomena, which we call the five skandhas. The five skandhas are constantly changing. They are so dynamic that they give rise to these notions of I. This is like a fast revolving fire torch that gives the illusion of a fire circle. So if everyone look at this image, it might seem like a circle to you, like one whole circle, but in reality, it is actually composed of five fast revolving fire torch. But then because it's so dynamic and it's moving so fast that it gives us the illusions of one whole circle. So what are the five skandhas? The five skandhas are body, feeling, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness. And if we look closely or observe them closely, we can actually classify them into, I would say, two categories. And basically, we can narrow it down to body and mind. And of course, form is the body. And feeling, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness belong to the categories of the mind. Oops, sorry about the slide there. So we cling to all of them, like all of these five factors, as I or mine, and that's why we call them the five clinging aggregate. And we refer to these five skandhas as ourself. Because of this, defilement and sufferings accompany us. And this is just like this person who have worn an armor, and we start to think that this armor is I, or a part of me, or it's me. So this is for us, this is the same with the five aggregate. We cling to these five aggregate and deludedly think that they are me or mine. And even though it might give us sufferings or uncomfort, but then we are still very attached to it. And so now let us examine what are each of the aggregates so we learn more about them. Because remember, we're carrying them as our burden. So we want to learn more about, okay, what kind of burden we're all carrying, right? So form basically refers to our body. And of course, our body is changing all the time. And the Buddha told us that our body are composed of the four great elements: the earth, which is referring to the solidity part, water, the cohesion part, and fire, heat, and air, the motion. So earth basically referring to anything that give us solidity, like our bone, our nails, our hair, our teeth, and so on. And water refer to anything that's cohesive, like our blood, sweat, saliva, and so on. And fire basically refer to our body temperature, and air refer to the motion of gas. So basically it's referring to our inhalation and our exhalations. And of course, we can definitely see that we're very attached to our body and think that it is ours. So sometimes when people ask us, okay, who are you? And we might start to answer it, well, you would start to describe yourself like I'm tall, I'm short, I'm thin, and so on. And of course, we can also see that we're attached to it through how much time we spend on it. Like we spend a lot of time getting beautiful clothes for it, cleaning it, and eating great food to nourish it, and so on. But of course, we should also learn that these attachment, overly attached to it, would lead to sufferings. And think about, we may become very stressed out or agitated when we become sick, or when we suddenly see a few more wrinkles on our face, or when we accidentally hurt our body, or when anything happened to our body. So basically, these will lead to our agitation or frustration and stress. Feelings. So basically, feelings are the feelings, referring to the feelings that arise from our six sense organ, which are the eyes, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, coming in contact with their associate objects. So that's why the Buddha said that, like, the six body of feelings are feelings born out of eye contact, feelings born out of ear contact, feelings born out of nose contact, feelings born out of tongue contact, and feelings born out of body contact, and feelings born of intellect contacts. So all these are referring to our feelings. And of course, our feelings can be categorized into three types. They are either pleasant feelings or unpleasant one, or they may be neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And for us, we become very attached to our feelings and we cling to them. And sometimes we think that these feelings are I or mine. Think of how often we would say, I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm comfortable, and so on. So perception. Perception basically refer to, there are six body perceptions, of course. There are perceptions of form, perceptions of sound, perceptions of smells, perception of taste, perception of tactile sensation, and perceptions of ideas. And of course, perception basically refer to how we cognize an objects. It is an act of perceiving things. It is conceiving of object from external phenomena, conceptualizing, making association, remembering the past and imagine the future. We can also say it is the formation of mental concepts. It is recognitions of things that include associated concept, background, past, image, and feelings. Perceptions can be called discrimination, recognition, or simply we can understand it as how we label these things. So these are the labels that we put on various things. And so what happens is when our sense organ interact with their associate objects, like the eye to sight, ear to sound, and so on, we will try to recognize what is it that we see or hear or smell. And when we're trying to recognize some things, we will search through our brain for the previous label that we use to identify these objects. So these labels might be what we learn from our childhood, or how we learn it from our parent, and maybe from our past experience, our past feelings. So all these are different labels that we have for this particular objects. And so we would also identify ourselves with these ideas and say that, okay, this is my ideas, this is my view, and so on. But however, sometimes this association can be wrong. And of course, for us, because we're very attached to our view, we would say that we're wrong. I mean, we're right and you're wrong. So we'll defend our view. And our view would affect us in terms of how we perceive the world and others. And of course, these thoughts in turn would govern our behaviors and actions. So having wrong view will definitely lead to sufferings in life, just like this father in the video. So how does this misunderstanding arise? If we analyze it, it's all because of the wrong perceptions of the father. From the father's point of view, of course, he viewed his son as the most important, and not to mention that his son was in such an dire state. So when he saw the doctor was late, he perceived that the doctor is irresponsible. And when the father replied, "How can you expect me to calm down?" when the doctor asked him to calm down, this is showing us that the father perceived that he had the right to be emotional because his son was in such a critical conditions. And of course, the father, based on what he saw in the hospital and his own wrong view, he thought that the doctor was rude and arrogant. And of course, what's the truth? And the truth is, this doctor came all the way to save his son and left his own son's funeral. And so sometimes we would just judge a person or a situation just based on what we think happened, or based on our view or perceptions at the time. So if we reflect back to our life, how often we might make a judgment on someone or a situation just based on what we perceive and like what we see and hear. Sometimes because of these wrong perceptions, we might misunderstand others or a situations. And of course, in the worst case scenario, it will lead to a conflict and argument. And of course, more afflictions for ourselves or problems for ourselves. This is why right view is placed as the first factors in the Noble Eightfold Path, because it would guide the rest of the factors and it would guide our actions. Only with the right view and understanding and seeing this world with clarity will we be free from sufferings. Okay. Volition. Volition is commonly known as our intentions or our view, or you might also see this translation, fabrications. And so let's see what did the Buddha said about fabrication. He said that there are these 6 classes of intention. Intention aimed at sight, sound, smell, taste, tactile sensations, and idea. These are fabrications. So basically, it's our intentions toward these 6 sense object, I would say. So volitions are also the mental activities that are fabricated after a person make a decision on what to do or what to say, of course, on that particular objects or situations. In another word, once our sixth sense collect information from their contact with their objects, then feelings and perceptions about these objects would arise, and after which they would then make a decision on what to do with it. For example, let's say there's a piece of chocolate cake in front of us. Our eyes see the cake, and of course, the associate eye consciousness arise, and we start our consciousness, the sixth consciousness, start to discriminate against it. And so it pull out our past feelings, like, oh, it's pleasant feelings because we love to eat it. And it start to pull out all these label associate with this chocolate cake. These perceptions might be, ooh, this is a chocolate cake. And it is one from my favorite store. And it is very good. And so after all these different various thoughts, you make up your mind, so you make a decision, like you have this intention on eating it. So then you put it in actions. So you put your hand out and get the plate of chocolate cake and start to eat it. And so basically volition is that intentions or will after you make this decision on what to do or say, I guess, on this particular objects. And of course, the intention would then motivate you to put it into actions. And a lot of time we identified with our volitional activities so much that we do assume an agent behind the doer, the speakers, and the thinker, thinking that our volitions is the self. So there's a self making all these decisions. Our volitional activities would then determine our futures. So let me tell you a little stories, basically, and from the Indian folklore that demonstrate this. So one day there are two young men who were traveling and they were lost in the forest. And as they continue with their travel, they met with a hermit. And this hermit has this abilities to predict the futures. So before the two young men left the forest, they asked the hermit to make a predictions for them. So the hermit was a bit reluctant at first, but ultimately he did make a prediction for them. So there are two young men. So one is called Paul and one is called Vijen. And so as the hermit was observing them closely, he predicted that Paul would become a king within a year, and Vijen would die in the hands of an assassin. And so when they heard it, of course, Paul became very happy because he would become a king in a year. And Vijen was very sad because he knew that he would die very soon. So both of them went back to their home. And after hearing these predictions, Paul became very arrogant in his behaviors toward others, thinking that he is going to be the king. And but Vijen became a teacher and he performed his duty consciously, and he became very virtuous and led a very humble life. After 6 months, Paul called his friend Vijen to go and search for a place to build a palace. And so they went to a deserted area. So as they were searching, Paul discovered a pot of gold. And he was very happy. When the two friends were examining the gold, a bandit, basically a group of bandits came by and wanted to snatch the gold from them. And so as Vijen was fighting the bandit and rescued the gold, he got cut from a knife, like from the bandit's weapon, and he was hurt. But then he managed to save the pot of gold. So after they went back, Vipod told Vijen that, oh, let me share this gold with you. And Vijen declined because of thinking that he would die in a few months. So Vipod took all the pot of gold and he spent it in eating and in luxuries and so on. And Vigen continued to spend his time in meditation and cultivation. A year passed by, the prediction didn't come true. So both friends went back to see the hermit and asked this hermit, how come the prediction didn't come true? And this is when the hermit explained that because Paul become very arrogant in his behavior, and he just like spend like his luxuries in the waste, so his fortune was actually reduced to that pot of gold. And for Vigen, because he then become very virtuous and always spend his time in meditation and cultivation, this virtuous behaviors was so powerful that it's enough to mitigate his misfortune to a mere wound in the hands of a band-aid. And so if we look at this, this is exactly what we learn from karma, right? We reap what we sow, basically. And so our volitions can be changed. So it's changing all the time. And of course, it determines our futures. For consciousness, it basically refers to our six consciousness, like eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and intellect consciousness. The first five consciousness are, of course, they relied on the five sense organ, like the eyes, ear, nose, tongue, and body. And these five consciousness would arise when the sense organ interact with their sense objects. So then the associate consciousness would arise. And so basically for these first five consciousness, they can only be aware of the object within its area. So what this means is that like the eyes, when the eyes see their sight, the eye consciousness arise. The eye consciousness can only be aware of what the eye see. It couldn't become aware of what the ear hear. And so these first five consciousness are basically just an awareness. So they do not discriminate. And of course, they help us with interacting with the world. So basically, these first five consciousness doesn't arise on their own. They only arise when their sense object, when their sense organ interact with the associate sense object. So an easy example would be when the eye see the sight, the eye consciousness would arise. So this eye consciousness can only be aware of what the eye see. But at that moment, they didn't discriminate at all. And so now let us talk about the sixth consciousness. The sixth consciousness is a little bit different. Basically, it functions in discriminations, contemplations, or thinking, determination, memorization, arising of all kinds of emotions. And of course, it would also create mental karma. And this sixth consciousness would arise alongside with the five consciousness so that it can discriminate what these five consciousness become aware. Let's go back to this example of the eye consciousness. So when I see the sight, eye consciousness would arise. So it became aware of the person is seeing something. But the sixth consciousness is the one that's going to discriminate what is it that the eye see. Is it the screen in front of me, and all the associate labels that associate with this object would also arise. And then of course it will make a decision like the intentions, and then so on. So for the sixth consciousness, it can also arise individually, like even though the five consciousness didn't arise, it can still arise on its own. So when would it arise on its own? It's when, let's say, a person is daydreaming. So whatever the person is daydreaming, that just arises on its own, right? Or when a person is sleeping and dreaming at night, or when a person is in deep meditative concentration. So all these different situation is when the sixth consciousness might arise on its own. And of course, a lot of time we take this consciousness as a self, and this is why we heard of a phrase such as, I think, therefore I am. So we basically take our thinking as the self. So in our daily life, we take our body, feelings, perceptions, volitions, and consciousness as the self, and we become attached to them and cling to them. And we're attached to them and cling to them because of our craving. We're craving for the passion and delight that might arise in these skandhas activities. And of course, this would ultimately lead to afflictions and sufferings. And just like what the Buddha told us in the sutras, he get attached to form, cling to form, and determine it to be myself. So we have read the sutras before, and because of this attachment to the five aggregate, it lead to his long-term loss and sufferings. So this is why the Buddha's short definitions of sufferings was the five clinging skandhas. And to end this clinging and attachment, we need to slowly wean our mind away from this clinging. We cannot like just drop it. We have to slowly wean our mind away. So as Venerable Thanissaro said, before we can reach the point of no intentions, where we're totally free from the fabrication of skandhas, we have to change our intentions toward the skandhas so as to change their functions. Instead of using them for the purpose of constructing a self, we use them for the purpose of creating a path to the ending of sufferings. Instead of carrying piles of bricks on our shoulders, we take them off and lay them along the ground as pavement. So in another word, the five clinging skandhas lead to our sufferings. However, we can also use them to deconstruct the self so that it leads to our liberation. We can use the skandhas to construct the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. We know that this deluded thinking of a self will lead to sufferings, so we can start with nurturing our perceptions of non-self to foster this passion. So, as the Buddha said, the five aggregate monks are impermanent. Whatever is impermanent, that is dukkha, unsatisfactory. Whatever is dukkha, that is without self. What is without self, that is not mine, that I'm not, that is not myself. Thus, should it be seen by perfect wisdom as it really is. We seize by perfect wisdom as it really is his mind, not grasping, is detached from taint, he is liberated. So we can be liberated and detached from these clinging if we can realize how we are actually non-self. So before we start to contemplate upon how the five skandhas are non-self, we should first understand what is this definition of a self. So the definition of a self, there are three criteria. So one is that it need to be permanent. And second, it should be one single whole entities. And third, the self should have total power and control, just like a king have total power over his land and his countries. And so now let us examine each of the skandhas and see if there is the self in it or not. Okay, let us look at our body. Is our body permanent? And of course, it can't be. Otherwise, we won't be who we are today. Obviously, all of us grow from a little baby to a child to a teenagers and to an adult, and in future will be an old person. So if our body is not changing, if our body is permanent, we might be a baby forever, or we might be just this one cell in our mother's womb forever. So obviously our body is changing all the time. So all these cells in our body are growing and decaying all the time. So this is why we can donate blood every 50, 60. And if we think about it, we cannot find a time when our body is not changing. It's definitely changing all the time. Although we can't see it, but then it's happening. It's just like all these cells on our skin, they're being replaced every month. So over a 24 hours period, we might lose thousands or even millions of cells. It's just that we're not aware of it before. So now if we look at our body, is it a single entity? And of course not, because our body is composed of billions of cells. So we're not one single entities. And can we have control to our body? Does our body have control? It doesn't. We cannot control ourselves from not getting old. We cannot control ourselves from not getting sick. So we have no control over it. And so the Buddha told us that when we contemplate about our body, we should think of it as a globe of foam in the river. If one observe and examine it, one would realize that it is empty of substance. We see the form, but it's empty in nature. And now let us look at our feelings. Our feelings is also changing all the time. We might be happy one moment, but we might be angry the next moment. And so there are times when we're sad, but maybe after talking to our friends, and we become happy again. So our feelings are changing. It is not static. It is not the same all the time. Otherwise, it would be so hopeless. Think about if I'm sad, and if it's not impermanent, then that means I'll be sad forever. That would be so sad, right? So hopeless. But obviously, luckily, it's not the case. So our feelings is changing all the time. And one example might be, like, let's say we're walking down the hallway and we see we hear someone slandered us. So we become mad, we become angry. So, but then ask yourself this, where is this anger before you hear the slander? Before you hear the slander, you're happy, you're okay. But then it's only after you hear the slander that you become angry. So our feelings are changing all the time. Even as you're sitting to listen to this video right now, you might be shifting your body because the feelings from your body is uncomfortable in one way. So you want to shift your body to make yourself comfortable, right? So even that is feelings and it's changing all the time. So the Buddha told us that our feelings is like a bubble. If one closely observe and examine it, one will realize that it is empty of substance. And of course, we look at a bubble, we can see it, but it's empty in nature. Perception is our labeling of things, and of course, our perceptions always also changes all the time. So let us look at this image. So everyone look at this rice bowl. At a first glance, it's a bowl that we can use to eat our dinner because this is how we learn it. So when you see a round bowl like this, basically we use it for eating, right? However, if we put it in front of our pet, then it becomes a dog bowl. So our pet use it to eat from it. And however, if we turn it upside down and then wear it on our head, then it becomes a bowl-shaped head, right? So that's a different perceptions. And then, however, if you see a monk carrying it in front of them to go for alms round, then it becomes very sacred. It's an alms bowl. And then if we use the same bowl and put some water and put our fish in it, then it becomes a fish bowl. And so if we put some soil and some plant to it, then it just becomes a pot, a flower pot. So all these are changing of perceptions. And so the Buddha did tell us that perception is like mirage. So if we really look at it, it seemed very real as we look at it. It seemed like, oh, it's there. But then in realities, is it real? It's not. It's I guess optical illusions. And so our perceptions is also the same. And of course, our perceptions also arise from causes and conditions, because it also based on, okay, who we learn it from and our background and so on. Okay. Volitions or our intentions also change based on the causes and conditions. So there's a Chan story that shows the impermanence of volitions. So once there's an old Chen master. He was practicing or meditating in a very simple hut on a mountain. And on this particular night, he was actually chanting the Buddha's name in his hut. And then there's this thief that broke in. So the thief looked everywhere, but he could not find anything except for a few coins. This thief was about to jump out of the window when the old master was actually aware of him the moment that he came in. And so this old master said to the thief, "Mister, why don't you exit from the front door? How can you enter from the wrong door and exit from the wrong place either? A person needs to be righteous, so you need to exit from the correct door." So the thief was shocked from hearing what the old master said. He turned to look at the old master, who looked at him with sincerity and also a sense of peacefulness. The thief calmed down and walked toward the door. But as he was about to exit, the old master said again, "Mister, if you have taken other people's things, you should at least say thank you." When the thief heard this, he was shocked again. But then this also eliminated his greed for the coins. He turned back to the old Chen master and repented for his bad deed. The old Chen master said to him, "For the same thing, if you steal, you're a thief. But if I give it to you, you will be grateful. But don't think that taking other people's belonging is a skill of yours. You should know that it is their grace to you." Because of the old master's kindness and wisdom, the thief realized how wrong he was. And so from then on, he worked very hard, and he's always filled with a sense of gratefulness. And he became very successful in his career and became very protective of Buddhism. So as we see from the story, our intentions of doing things or saying things are not permanent. Doing something wrong once doesn't mean that you would do the same thing forever. We can make changes. We can improve ourselves. If we're mindful, we can change our bad intentions, which might arise due to our bad habit or maybe from our greed, anger, and ignorance. And we can change those bad intentions to good intentions. The Buddha told us that volitions is like this planting trees. So planting trees are sort of like banana trees, I would say. So if we examine it and observe it closely and try to find the hard wood inside it, we will realize that we can't find it. On the surface, when you look at it, it seems like there is a tree trunk. However, if we peel off all these layers, we'll realize that it's empty inside. There is no hardwood inside. And so now, last but not least, looking at consciousness. So remembered how each of these consciousness arise? It basically arises when the sense organ come in contact with their objects. And of course, the associate consciousness would arise. So think about, our eyes are looking at a lot of things every single moment, and our attentions on these objects in our environment also changes moment to moment. Therefore, how can the consciousness that arises be permanent? So basically, it's arising, disappearing, arising, disappearing. It's very dynamic. As you're listening to what I'm saying right now, this changes moment to moment. Therefore, the ear consciousness that arises must be different every single moment. It will be like a series of beads of water, just like when you open up the tap, water pour out. The column of water that you see pouring out are composed of immeasurable amount of droplet of water. Our consciousness are the same. Did you hear that sound? If you listen to that sound, the moment you hear the sound, it already disappeared. And of course, that consciousness arises and disappeared. It is the same for all the blames and reprimand that we heard. These words are gone the moment that we hear them because they're impermanent. However, we like to grasp to these words in our consciousness and replay them over and over again, and obviously we might hurt ourselves again and again and become more angry. The Buddha told us that consciousness is like the magic performed by the magician. If one closely observed and examined it, one would realize that it's empty of substance. So the magic is just optical illusion that seem real, but it's not. If we can observe the five skandhas as impermanent and emptied in nature, the Buddha said, seeing thus, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones grow disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feelings, disenchanted with perceptions, disenchanted with fabrications, disenchanted with consciousness, disenchanted. He grows dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is released. With release, there is the knowledge, released. He discerned that birth is ended, the holy life fulfilled, the task done, there is nothing further for this world. So if we can really understand the true nature or the true realities of the five skandhas, then we can become disenchanted with them. And of course, when we're disenchanted, we would be dispassionate toward them. And of course, when we're dispassionate toward them, then we're liberated. So because we have no craving for them. And so this is why it's important for us to contemplate or analyze it for ourselves to see why the five skandhas are non-self. It is very hard for us to change our perceptions of the self in just one day. So we have to contemplate it and analyze it for ourselves basically very often. If possible, I would recommend that you can try to do this contemplation every single day just for 5 minutes, maybe right after. I would suggest that you can do this contemplation while you're taking a walk. Or maybe after meditations. So gradually, through our experience and practice, we'll one day realize that the five skandhas are indeed non-self. Sometimes, when we talk about how we're non-self, we would have this fear, and we might have questions like, if there's no self, then who am I? And we would start to panic. However, we have to realize that when we're talking about these questions or asking about these questions, I should say, we're actually falling into this dualistic view. like we already assume that there's an I, so now I lost this I, that's why I panic. And so that's why it make it even harder for us to understand why there's no self. But then if we think about this way, let's say if everyone look at this table, if someone said this table is not made out of gold, this saying would not decredit or the table at all, because this table is not made with gold to begin with. So it doesn't lose anything or it doesn't increase anything. But of course, if this table is made with gold before and now we say that it's not, then obviously we basically harm the value of the table. Similarly, this is the same thing with ourself. If we do have a self before and now the Buddha told us there isn't, then we would feel like, oh, we lose something. However, there isn't a self to begin with. The Buddha is just telling us that we're a non-self, refuting this notion of self, just telling us, okay, this is the realities of what we are. We also arise from causes and conditions, and of course, for us, we arise. These five aggregate make up us, I would say. So if we think about it, we confine and trap ourselves thinking that the five skandhas is the self and our world is confined. This is just like a frog. If you look at this frog in the well, so when this frog lived in the well, he think that this well is his world. He would be confined within the well and think that, oh, this is all there is. And he wouldn't realize there is so much more outside, but he's trapped within this well. And so for us, in a way, we're also trapped within this prison that we create by thinking that the five skandhas is the self. However, if we really understand about non-self, we have freed ourselves, so we're unbound. And because we're unbound, we can be more creative and we can improve. We can be better and better. It is because of it is because it's non-self that everything is possible. Like, for example, in the past, people would only think that birds can fly. So, and human cannot, because we're on the ground, we don't have wings. And so they can only look at how the bird flies in the sky. However, as our perception change, since advancement in science and technology and so on, things change, our perception change. So airplane is created, and now it's possible to fly in the sky. And so if we don't restrict ourselves, we can be so much more creative, we can improve, and things are possible. So to conclude, we should just understand that the five skandhas, we should try to view the five skandhas from the perspective of how it actually leads to sufferings and how we can use the five skandhas to pave the way to the liberation or cessation of sufferings. So last but not least, thank you very much for listening. And so please take care and stay safe. So I'll see you all in next class. Thank you.